Hello, good day. I want to thank the conference organizers for giving me this opportunity to present at this conference once again. It's very nice to be back here again and to present in this conference. I always learn a lot of things from here, and I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity. My name is Djurslandsnet Williams, and I'm a PhD fellow here at CMI Aalborg University here in Copenhagen. And today we're going to discuss the role of community broadband networks and what lessons we could learn from these community broadband networks that exist all around the world, and how this can be replicated in rural sub-Saharan Africa. So the title of my presentation is The Role of Community-Based Networks in the Development of Rural Broadband. The case of Djurslandsnet in Denmark and lessons for rural sub-Saharan Africa. In the course of this presentation, I'm going to introduce it, and then I'll have a little overview of Djursland, where it's located, and the socioeconomic activities in Djursland. And then we'll proceed to talking about Djurslandsnet. And then we will use the actor network theory to analyze the translation of power in Djurslandsnet from the inception of the idea till when the idea materialized into a full-fledged broadband network in this community. And then we will compare the characteristics that we find in the process of developing Djurslandsnet to rural sub-Saharan Africa to see if those characteristics exist. We will also look at the barriers to see if those barriers also exist in rural sub-Saharan Africa. And then we will look at the way forward and make a conclusion to this presentation. This presentation is aimed at providing an inspiration for developing community broadband networks in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the rural areas. And community broadband networks are broadband networks developed for communities by non-profit organizations or other societies that have nothing to do with the government, for the purpose of providing affordable broadband to citizens of the community. So it is basically a community-based initiative. And like I mentioned earlier, these broadband networks exist in many rural areas around the world. But the little problem we have here, as I delved into this research, was that we have very few of these networks in Africa. In South Africa, we have a lot of broadband networks, but they exist in urban South Africa. I have done a little research there, and I've also had to interview some of these broadband networks in South Africa, and I think probably in the next conference I would love to discuss about that, and probably we could share ideas and see how we could move on from there. And the beautiful thing about the broadband networks that these communities develop is that it is a bottom-up approach to developing broadband infrastructure in rural areas. And one of the beautiful things about broadband, and especially wireless broadband, is that there are so many wireless possibilities that can be used in developing these wireless broadbands. So in a way, we do not necessarily have to deploy the same broadband infrastructure that exists in the city. In rural areas, we could bring the rural areas up gradually to a place where a market is built that is conducive for big network operators to come in and to operate. And these networks, the network that I'm going to use here is the one that exists in Denmark. There are lots of them in Europe, in South America that I have studied. And the one that exists in Denmark is the Djurslandsnet initiative. So I'm going to look at this network, analyze this network, and then let's see what lessons we could learn from here and how that could be applicable to our case in sub-Saharan Africa. I have mentioned Djursland earlier on, and Djursland is a peninsula in the south. No, it's not in the south. It's in the northern part of Denmark, in Jylland, northeast precisely, and the land size is about 44 kilometers by 33 kilometers. And there are two municipalities that make up this Djursland community. And in Ghana or in Africa, we would call it local governments or districts. Initially, they had 8 municipalities, but after 2007, with the Danish municipality reform, it was merged into 2 municipalities. And the population of Djursland is about 80,000, about 79,000, 80,000. The first municipality is called Nordjurs, and the second municipality is called Sydjurs. Nordjurs, that is North Djursland, and Sydjurs, that is South Djursland. And the topography of Djursland is quite hilly. When we went there on a visit for this research actually, we discovered that it was a very hilly terrain, and it also has a lot of forest. So in a sense, there are certain similarities between the topography of Djursland and rural sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, the houses will be different, the people will be different, etc. But in terms of topography, yes, they have the same challenges. And there are 2 main towns in Djursland. They have a lot of other smaller towns, but the 2 main towns are Greno and Ebeltoft. Djurslandsnet is a very interesting phenomenon, I would say. It began with this fine arts teacher. His name was Bjarke Nelson, who used to repair computers for his colleagues and people who knew him. And after a while, these people that he repaired the computers for came together to learn from him, some of them mostly how to repair computers. And he christened it the BOL movement. BOL in Danish means problem solving. And it was in the process of this BOL movement that he conceived an idea that wireless communication is the network for the future. And at that moment in Djursland, they had very poor mobile services. I mean, no mobile network operator was willing to invest in Djursland. So these people were eager to have a much better communication. And at that time, broadband was new, but they knew that what they wanted was broadband communications. And they decided to come together and share ideas and see how this could be developed. And the man that was at the forefront of this was Bjarke Nelson. Actually, in order for us to get to know this network, we had to visit Djursland. We spoke to Bjarke and a volunteer there in Djursland. And it's the proceeds of our interaction that we will talk about here. The Djurslandsnet metamorphosed from the BOL movement to become a cooperative society where people all over Djursland came together for the purpose of developing a network. But what they did was to have a centralized Djurslandsnet board, and this board had sub-boards. Remember, I told you earlier that Djursland initially had 8 municipalities, but people were more familiar with these 8 municipalities. So these boards were centered around these former 8 municipalities, and they had volunteers who volunteered with this board. So it was more of a decentralized system where each and every one of the individuals or citizens of Djursland were very much eager to develop this broadband connectivity in Djursland. And each board was able to raise money, each board was able to raise volunteers, and they were able to build this network, and it still exists today. And one thing that also helped them was that they got a very small amount from the European Union, which we are going to talk about later in the process of this presentation. Now, that's Djurslandsnet in a nutshell. Let's now go deeper into the minds of these people using the actor network theory. Actor network theory is a broad theory that has various facets and various dimensions. But the aspect that I love is this sociology of translation by Michael Callon. He came up with this idea of sociology of translation, and it involves how the power shifts in a network from the process of conception to the process with which this network becomes a reality. So Michael Callon, in this case, looked at 4 stages in this process of translation. The first stage is the problemization stage, where the principal actor, the central actor, defines the problem and forces others to adopt this problem. We have the entrustment phase, where the principal actors define the stakeholder framework with which the various actors will fit into. And then they have the enrollment stage, where the principal actors then define the specific roles of each stakeholders. And the final stage is the mobilization stage, where the specific stakeholders finally recruit each stakeholders, and the primary stakeholder now becomes a voice for the whole network. So these are the 4 stages that we're going to look at. At the problemization stage, the actor network that existed was imaginary, because at the minds of these people, they knew that if they were to go into this network, they would need different external stakeholders like funding organizations, like government organizations, and every other organizations which would help them up. Remember, these are people from rural areas, which is different from people from the city. Of course, we would say that rural areas in Denmark would be different from rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, but of course, let's still look into this case. Bjarke defined the problem, and the actors he had to inform were members of the Bowl group. And the initial stakeholders that started this whole idea thinking was Bjarke and the members of the Bowl group. And the initial proposal to use a wireless technology here was Bjarke Nelson. And the associations they had to inform were the Djursland Business Association, the mobile network operators, and the internet service providers. So if we look at this actor network at this point, we have 2 networks with 1 actor. And the first network is wireless technology, which is a network consisting of different varieties of wireless technologies, which we do not really know. The second network is the Bowl group, which consists of the members, the different portfolios, the artifacts used there. So that's part of the network, because actor network theory takes into, consideration both human and non-human actors. So this was an interesting network where you had 2 networks dealing with 1 actor, which is the initiator, that is Bjarke Nelson. Now, the moment Bjarke shared his ideas with members of the Bowl group, now the members of the Bowl group were enthused, and the reason they had to listen to him was because, 1, he had interest in what he was talking about. He had a previous telecenter management experience. He also had previous experience with computer repairs of the network. I mean, we could say that he was some form of a nerd, even though he was a fine arts teacher, but people could look at his track record, at his personal development and the projects that he was involved in successfully, and people placed their confidence on him. And of course, one of the most critical factors here was that everybody wanted to have affordable broadband, and they thought his idea was a laudable idea. However, the biggest problem they had here was that the Djursland Business Association did not share their idea. So that is one part of the proposed funding network depleting. The Danish government was not interested in it because the Danish government's policy is that the market should be allowed to lead to the expansion of the network. Market mechanism should be the roadmap to leading to expansion of networks. As far as they were concerned, the market will facilitate the development of this network with time. But the people of Djursland were not willing to wait for the market, because for them they thought they would be disenfranchised for a long time. So of course the Danish government was out but they had the possible funding source from the EU. But the problem here was that for the EU, they had to raise money and start the project, and the EU will just pay back the amount of money with which the EU promised to give. So, I mean, they were virtually from zero. So if you look at the funding source of the network that was out right now, the next network that they also conceived were the perceived users. They had to convince people in Djursland. This was a small group of people who had a very lovely idea, and Djursland has 80,000 people, so these people have to be convinced. So they had that imaginary network at the back of their minds. So we could now look at an actor network where you have technology on one side, which was just wireless technology. Then you had the Djurslandsnet board, which is a network on its own. Then you had the funding sources, which is a network on its own, and you also have the potential new members. But however, now the funding sources was depleted, and you are now left with the actor, which is EU funding, and Wi-Fi was now chosen after much internal rancor and human interaction. Wi-Fi was chosen as the network of choice, so Wi-Fi replaced technology. And finally, we had this Djursland board as well. Now, one thing we have to understand here is that the moment the Djursland's net board bought the idea from Biake, the Bowl movement, I'm sorry to run ahead of time. The moment the Bowl movement bought the idea from Biake, they formed a committee. And the moment they formed the committee, power was no more in Biake's hands. In principle, he had power, but in practice, power was now in the hands of this committee. And this committee decided to register their name, the new name, as Djurslandsnet. So the board now had the power, and the board now ran with Biake's vision. Of course, Biake was the chairman, but in Denmark, there is this democracy in association. So it's a collective decision. We can't necessarily say that he is the only one that had to do everything on his own. And of course, the board were one of the advantages the board could see was that there was a fiber optic termination in a nearby town of Ranas, which they could connect to, and they had this possibility of EU funding. They had this potential of wireless technology, which was Wi-Fi, and they were very much interested in the fact that the broadband will create a network effect where they could communicate with one another. So as this process moved on, they came to a point where they discovered that they're not going to get help from the government, they're not going to get help from the business association, they're not going to get help from many sources, so they decided to go on their own. So the only source of fund they had at that moment was the EU funding. So that is when they decided to create a framework of themselves. That is when they decided to create a network of themselves. And in this network, like we mentioned earlier, they had a central board. Then they decided that in the former 8 municipalities, they are going to have sub-boards in which the chairman and the secretary of those sub-boards will be a member of the central board. Now, the process I'm talking about now is the second phase of the sociology of translation, which is the entrustment phase. They are building this framework. And these sub-boards had to go out and mobilize people. And they went out to meet people with different ideas, telling them the advantages of broadband, that is going to create employment, they are going to have cheap internet access, it's not going to cost them anything. And of course, these were people that wanted a much better technology, so they did buy onto the idea. And the financing organization was that each member that signs up would pay 1,000 krona once for access. Then the person would pay 100 kronas every month for for monthly subscription. And so with this amount of money, they would be able to buy the equipment, and they will be able to build the network. And that one would say that at this point that they had a sort of self-will, despite all the odds, despite all the circumstances and the discouragements that they faced from different areas. And one of the beautiful things they did was that they had to go on the internet, they had to attend courses on how to build networks and, develop these extended networks. If you go to Djursland, it's very, very amazing to know that the network was not built by professional engineers, but the network was built by people who knew nothing about technology, in part, mostly volunteers. And they still run the network till this very day. And from the entrustment phase, after they had developed the framework, the next thing was to appoint roles. What is the chairman going to do? What is the secretary going to do? What will the members of the sub-board do? And of course, the sub-board had to raise finances and also bring in volunteers. And finally, we moved to the mobilization phase, where they had to recruit members by door-to-door broadband evangelism, and they had parish seminars and conferences as well. Their selling points, like I mentioned earlier on, was that the broadband will keep young people from moving to the city. They will be in Djursland, and the nerd community in Djursland will be able to create innovations from Djursland, and of course, it will make Djursland a tourist attraction. So these selling points did really go a very, very long way in helping them. So with this framework in place and the little funding from the EU, they were able to build this dynamic, unbelievable Wi-Fi network. I mean, I don't know if you know of this Djursland network in India. It's one of the largest in the world. Actually, I had an interview with them as well. But the difference between that one and the Wi-Fi network is that the Djursland was built by technical people, but the Djursland was just built by the people from grassroots. So between 2001 and 2005, Djurslandsnet was built, and today everybody in Djursland has access to 2 megabits of broadband in their homes. Now let's look at what were the factors that made what were the barriers, that the people of Djursland faced. When I looked at it very, very critically, I discovered that one, the people did not know much about this network. They had no knowledge about it. All they knew was that Wi-Fi could help them solve their broadband problems. All they knew that was with wireless technology, you don't have to spend as much money as you would with fixed technologies. So they knew nothing about this. And of course, their business case was not sound, of course. So that is why the Danish Djursland Business Association and the network operators were not willing to buy into the idea. And of course, they also lacked personnel. Now, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, in rural areas, of course, we don't have too many people that know about broadband in the first place, apart from maybe 1 or 2 educated people. In rural areas as well, we don't even have these feasibility studies. Nobody has done anything around there. And thirdly, if you look at lack of qualified personnel, we don't have it as well. So in this sense, when we look at it, we realize that, we're not that different from the people in Djursland. Now, if I look at the characteristics that enabled these people to go, that facilitated the need for them to build this broadband network, one of them is that mobile service delivery was poor. In Africa, we would not necessarily say that it is that poor, but in many rural areas in Africa, because I've been to a lot of places, mobile services in rural areas is very, very poor. And if we look at the initiators, we discover that these people were enthusiastic learners in Djursland. In Africa, of course, we have people who would be enthusiastic learners. But of course, if you look at the guy in Djursland, he has a job, he has a wife, he has a family, and he has a livelihood. But if you look at the person in rural sub-Saharan Africa, he doesn't have the same livelihood, so he wouldn't have the time to think of broadband. If you look at Djursland, there were funding possibilities, even though it did not work out for them. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, there are lots of funding possibilities. Universal Access and Service funds, we have funds from international donor agencies, we have funds from even government sources, so there is funding as well. If you look at Djursland, you discover that they had self-will. Now, if we look at Africa, we discover that this self-will has to be facilitated. Now, if you look at the socio-economic conditions of people in rural sub-Saharan Africa and people in Djursland, you discover that, of course, they are different. So in as much as the initial barriers are the same, we discover that as we come into to look at the factors that facilitated the success of these networks, we suddenly realize that, hey, there are a bit of differences here, so we don't expect to really mobilize people in Africa to build these networks. So what is the way forward here? Now, the way forward here is that there has to be some form of incentive and facilitation from the government or from NGOs or from knowledgeable bodies to people in these rural areas on the advantages of broadband and what it can do for them and what they can create, what value they can create for themselves. And we also realize that in sub-Saharan Africa, there are a lot of social structures. We have the chiefs, we have village chairman, there is an existing structure that can easily work as a cooperative. I mean, we have villages in Africa that have raised money to bring in electricity, raised money to bring in water supply, and these villages can do it. I mean, some of them raise this money over time, so it is very, very possible for this to be done. And if we look at that, one, we discover that we now have these sub-networks now, just like Djurslandsnet. They exist. We have this potential. We have source of funding, like I mentioned earlier. They exist as well. So the most important thing now is that the government or the regional government now has to act as the central body to now coordinate these people, source for fundings and send funding down there, and also look at ways in which people in these rural areas can also raise funds for themselves. And if we look at this scenario, this calls for a public-private collaboration. I believe very much, I'm concluding right now, that community networks are great tools for deploying affordable broadband internet solutions in rural areas. I also believe that this case of Djurslandsnet implies that the will of the people, the bottom-up approach could complement the existing top-down approach as a solution for delivering broadband in rural sub-Saharan Africa. We have the funding sources, and we now have to think of these possible public-private collaborations. I want to thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I have not taken much of your time. Thank you very much. I'll be waiting live at the other end for your questions if you have any. I'm very grateful. Thank you.